The water glass sat between them on the polished conference table, catching the fluorescent light from above. Dean Averill leaned across the table, his hand closing around the glass in front of Vivian Colston before she could lift it to her lips. 9 board members froze mid-breath. A woman near the window pressed her fingers to her mouth. Vivian's eyes locked on his not anger. Not yet. Just a question with no words attached to it. Dean said nothing. He set his own glass down in its place and stepped back. And for 3 full seconds, nobody in that room moved at all. 6 hours earlier, Dean Averill had been exactly what everyone in that building believed him to be. The man who filled water pitchers, arranged catering trays, and made sure the coffee never ran cold during earnings calls. He moved through Northgate Holdings' 40th floor the way furniture moved, present, useful, unnoticed. Executives in $600 suits stepped around him without breaking their conversations. He preferred it that way. Invisibility, he had learned, was its own kind of safety. That morning had started the way most mornings started, with a small ritual that belonged only to him and his daughter. Ruby sat at the kitchen counter in Denver's gray early light, backpack already on, lunchbox waiting by the door. Dean knocked on the lid 3 times before handing it to her, once for luck, once for love, once because she insisted the number had to be 3 or the day would go wrong. She rolled her eyes at 9 years old, the way only a 9-year-old could, half embarrassed, half grateful, and grabbed the box anyway. "You're going to be late," she told him, checking the clock on the microwave. "I'm never late," Dean said, which was mostly true and entirely beside the point of a father who had learned to build his whole life around not missing things twice. He drove her to school, watched her disappear through the double doors without looking back, and then drove downtown to a building where nobody knew his name unless they needed something carried. Vivian Colston's morning had started very differently. By 7, she was already in her office on the 40th floor, going over merger numbers with a expression that gave away nothing to the assistants filing in and out. Northgate's board had spent 2 weeks circling the vote on the Ashcombe acquisition, and every hour that passed without consensus put more weight behind Foster Loughlin's quiet campaign to be seen as the only adult left in the room. In the hallway outside her office, Foster passed her without a word, his eyes doing the kind of measuring that had nothing to do with courtesy. Down on the service level, Dean prepared the water service for the 10 o'clock board meeting the way he always did: glass pitchers, folded napkins, name cards set precisely 3 inches from the edge of the table. It was routine work that asked nothing of the part of his mind that used to spend 12-hour days identifying trace compounds and blood samples. That part of him had gone quiet years ago, the way a muscle goes quiet when it stops being used. Except this morning, something in the routine snagged. The tray of glasses that came up from the executive kitchen carried a faint smell that didn't belong, something sharp and clean, almost too clean, layered under the ordinary scent of filtered water. Dean paused with a glass in his hand for half a second longer than the task required. He told himself it was dish soap residue. He told himself the kitchen had probably switched cleaning products again. He set the glasses out anyway, 1 at each seat. Vivian's placed at the head of the table where it always went. But the feeling didn't leave when he walked away. It followed him down the hall, small and persistent. The kind of unease he hadn't felt in 4 years, not since the last time his training had told him something was wrong before his conscious mind caught up. He told himself he was imagining things. He had a meeting to set up, trays to clear, a daughter to pick up at 3:15. He walked back into the boardroom 5 minutes before the meeting began anyway, telling himself it was only to check the napkins. By noon, the 40th floor was a different kind of quiet, the kind that follows an incident nobody wants to name out loud yet. Human Resources had already pulled Dean's personnel file, because a facilities employee reaching across a board table to swap the chief executive's water glass in front of 9 directors and 2 outside counsel was, by any definition, an incident. Priya Nathanson, 26 months into her job in HR, and still new enough to read files instead of skimming them, found something that made her sit back in her chair. Dean Averill's employment history before Northgate wasn't the 2 lines she expected from a facilities hire. It was 4 pages. Halloran Pharmaceutical Research Division, 9 years, clinical toxicology, 3 peer-reviewed papers on trace compound identification in solution, a name listed as co-investigator on a patent for rapid contaminant detection. Then a gap. Then Northgate, hired 3 years ago into logistics and hospitality services, no toxicology, no chemistry, nothing that explained the drop. She printed the file and sat with it for a long moment, before deciding, quietly, to keep it to herself until someone asked the right question. Down in security, Emmett Doyle had already watched the footage 4 times. He was 61 years old. 22 of those years spent behind a bank of monitors that had taught him to read a room the way other men read a book. What he saw on the screen wasn't panic. It wasn't an accident, or a stumble, or a man reaching for the wrong glass by mistake. The movement was clean, economical, and timed to the second, the kind of motion a person only made when they already knew exactly what they were looking for and exactly how much time they had to fix it. Emmett rewound the clip a 5th time, then closed the file without sending it anywhere. Not yet. Vivian, for her part, did not summon Dean to her office. She had thought about it, had her hand halfway to the phone twice, and stopped both times. There was no version of that conversation that made sense yet, and asking a facilities employee to explain himself before she understood anything felt like the wrong kind of power to use. Instead, she called down to security and ordered the original glass, the one Dean had pulled from the table, sealed and sent to an independent lab rather than Northgate's internal one. She trusted almost no one in the building completely today, and she trusted the building's own testing equipment least of all. The results came back at 4:15, faster than anyone expected, because Vivian had paid for the expedited option without telling her assistant why. The lab found a compound in the original glass that had no business being in a glass of filtered water, a sedative agent, present in a concentration too small to be lethal but more than enough to blur a person's speech, slow their reactions, and make a chief executive look unsteady, confused, and unfit in front of 9 board members and 2 lawyers during the most contested vote of her career. Vivian read the report twice at her desk, alone, the numbers rearranging themselves into a shape she didn't want to look at directly. The question in the building had changed in the space of 1 phone call. It was no longer why did the facilities man touch the CEO's water. It was now sitting under every conversation on the 40th floor like a live wire nobody wanted to step on. Who put it there, and why? Vivian called Dean to her office 2 days later, and the silence in the elevator on his way up said more than either of them would say once he arrived. Her office was smaller than people expected from a chief executive: a desk, 2 chairs, a window that looked out over the front range when the clouds allowed it. Dean stood just inside the door until she gestured for him to sit, which he did carefully, the way a man sits in a room he doesn't believe he belongs in. "I wanted to thank you," Vivian said, and the sentence came out stiffer than she'd planned. She had rehearsed something warmer in the mirror that morning, and lost it somewhere between her desk and this moment. "For the water. For whatever it was you saw." "I'm not sure what I saw," Dean said, which was true and also not the whole truth. "Something didn't smell right. I've been doing this long enough to trust that." Neither of them said the word toxicologist. Neither of them said facilities either. The conversation stayed exactly where 2 strangers, standing on opposite sides of an org chart, keep a conversation polite, careful, full of sentences that ended before they became questions. Vivian didn't ask what he used to do before Northgate. Dean didn't ask why a company on the edge of a hostile boardroom fight would have someone tampering with the CEO's water. There was no natural door into either question, and so neither of them forced one open. "The lab confirmed there was something in the water," Vivian said instead. "I wanted you to hear that from me before you heard it from someone else." Dean nodded slowly. Something in his jaw tightened. The specific stillness of a man doing arithmetic he didn't want to be doing. "Then I'm glad I trusted it," he said and stood, because the meeting had reached the edge of what either of them knew how to say next. 3 floors down in a glass-walled conference room reserved for private calls, Foster Lachlan was having a very different conversation. Across from him sat Harlan Voss, the largest single shareholder outside the founding family, a man who had backed 3 different chief executives in the past decade and outlasted every one of them. "She's rattled," Foster said, choosing the word with care. "A health scare like this, right before the Ashcombe vote, the board's going to ask whether she's fit to lead the company through something this size." Voss said nothing for a long moment, turning his coffee cup a quarter turn on the table. "Rattled isn't removed, Foster." "No," Foster agreed. "Not yet." That evening, Dean picked Ruby up from her after-school program 11 minutes later than usual, and she noticed before he'd even parked the car. "You're doing the late thing again," she said, buckling herself in without being asked. "Work's just busy this week," Dean said, which wasn't a lie exactly, and Ruby let it go the way children let go of things that don't affect dinner or bedtime, filing it away without asking the follow-up question that would have cost him more to answer. Back on the 40th floor, long after most of the lights had gone dark, Denise Marrow sat alone at her desk outside Vivian's office, staring at nothing in particular. She had overheard enough of the day's fragments, a sealed glass, an outside lab, Foster's private meetings running longer than usual to know something was wrong beneath the version of events everyone was being told. She had a mortgage, a sister in nursing school she helped support, and 6 years of loyalty to a company that had never once asked her opinion on anything that mattered. But she also had the particular restlessness of a person who has started noticing things she can no longer unnotice, and that night, for the first time, she opened the old personnel archive on her screen without knowing exactly what she was looking for. The second incident happened 4 days later, in the small kitchen off the executive lounge, and for 6 tense hours it looked exactly like a repeat of the first. An assistant reheating lunch found a film across the surface of a bowl of prepared fruit that hadn't been there that morning. Security was called before anyone thought to ask a simpler question, and by the time the sample reached the lab, the building had spent half a day bracing for another confirmation. It came back clean. A cleaning solution had been mixed at the wrong ratio by a new contractor and left a residue that looked, to an already frightened staff, exactly like the thing everyone was now primed to see everywhere. It was nothing. It felt like everything. Dean heard about it secondhand, from a caterer restocking the lounge, and something in him that had been dormant for 4 years quietly woke up further. He started keeping a small notebook in his jacket pocket. Nothing official. Just times and observations he didn't trust himself to remember later who had access to the executive kitchen. When deliveries arrived, which badge readers logged which hours. He told no one. Reporting any of it through official channels meant explaining why a facilities coordinator was tracking access logs, and he had learned the hard way, once, what happened to people who knew too much and said so too soon. Vivian, meanwhile, had started finding reasons to be on the service level more often than her schedule strictly required. A question about the vendor contract for the coffee service. A follow-up on whether the water pitchers needed replacing. Each reason was real enough to survive scrutiny and thin enough that Dean noticed the pattern within the first 3 visits. Their conversations stayed exactly as formal as they had been in her office. But something had shifted in how long each one lasted, how often her eyes moved to his hands when he spoke, as if some part of her was still trying to reconcile the careful, quiet man in front of her with the 6 seconds of certainty she'd watched on the security footage. Emmett Doyle found Dean alone by the loading dock on a Thursday evening and didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Someone upstairs wants this pinned on you," he said. "Not the water, the attention. A facilities man who moves like he's done something like this before makes people nervous, and nervous people upstairs like a name to attach to nervous." "Whose name?" Dean asked, though he already suspected. Emmett didn't answer directly. "Keep your notebook somewhere they won't think to look," he said instead, and walked away before Dean could ask how he knew about the notebook at all. Dean stood alone on the loading dock a long while after Emmett had gone, turning the warning over the way he used to turn over an ambiguous lab result, before writing it up looking for what it confirmed and what it left carefully unsaid. He didn't know Emmett well enough to guess how much the older man actually understood, only that a person who spent 2 decades watching a building's cameras learned to see the shape of a threat before it had fully formed, and that whatever shape Emmett had seen, it had been enough to make him break his own habit of silence, however briefly. 4 days later, in a board meeting called to review facilities' security protocols, Foster Lachlan raised the matter himself, his tone reasonable, almost regretful, exactly the register of a man who wanted everyone to know how much he hated having to say what he was about to say. "I think, given the ongoing investigation, it would be prudent to place the employee involved on administrative leave," Foster said. "Not as an accusation, as a precaution, for the company's protection, and frankly, for his." 3 directors nodded before Vivian could speak. She looked around the table, counting silently, and understood with a cold, settling certainty that the votes were already there whether she objected or not. The vote passed 7-2, and Vivian signed the administrative leave order with a pen that felt heavier than it should have, in an office that had gone very quiet around her. She had tried, in the 10 minutes before the vote, to build an argument that didn't depend on gratitude she couldn't yet explain to a room full of directors. Gratitude wasn't evidence. A feeling wasn't a defense. She had nothing on paper that said Dean Averill had done anything other than reach across a table uninvited, and against nothing on paper, Foster's careful, reasonable, regretful tone had won by a wide enough margin that her objection would have looked like something other than good judgment. She called Dean herself rather than letting him hear it from HR, and kept the call as short and as honest as she could make it. "I don't believe you did anything wrong," she told him. "I need you to know that separately from what this letter says." "I understand," Dean said. And the strange thing was that he did, more than she expected him to. He had spent 4 years watching how organizations protected themselves first and people second. And this was simply that instinct, working exactly the way it was built to work. He picked Ruby up on time that day, for once, and waited until she was through her homework and halfway through dinner before he told her, in the gentlest version of the truth he could construct, that he wouldn't be going into work for a little while. "Did you do something bad?" Ruby asked, not accusing. Just 9 years old and trying to understand the shape of a thing adults kept vague on purpose. "No," Dean said. "Sometimes grown-ups get things wrong about other grown-ups, and it takes time to sort out who's right." She studied him for a moment with the particular seriousness only children bring to questions they've decided matter, then climbed into his lap even though she was nearly too big for it, and he held on to her a beat longer than the hug required, long enough that she eventually patted his arm the way she did when she thought he needed reassuring instead of the other way around. That night, on the 40th floor, Denise Marrow was still at her desk long after the cleaning crew had come and gone. Working through the old personnel and incident archive she'd started 3 nights earlier out of nothing more than a feeling she couldn't name to anyone who'd ask her to justify it. She almost missed it. The file was misfiled under a case number from a different department, an old auto accident report that had been pulled 6 years ago for an insurance claim and never properly refiled. She opened it only because the date caught her eye a winter night, a stretch of icy road outside Denver, a single-vehicle accident. The name on the claimant line was Vivian Colston, then a vice president 3 levels below where she sat now. The report was thin, mostly boilerplate, but one line near the bottom made Denise sit up straight in her chair. A witness had called it in and administered first aid before paramedics arrived, then left the scene before giving a full statement. The responding officer's handwritten note described a man, middle-aged, who declined to give his name for the record. Denise read the line 3 times, then reached for her phone to check the date against something she'd seen in a different file entirely, and felt the particular chill of 2 unrelated facts sliding, unbidden, into place beside each other. Denise didn't sleep well that night, and by morning she'd made a decision that scared her more than almost anything she'd done in 6 years at Northgate. She didn't take the file to HR, and she didn't take it to Emmett Doyle, because either path meant explaining why she'd been digging through archived records outside her job description, and she wasn't ready to answer that question from anyone but Vivian herself. She waited until Vivian was between meetings, knocked once, and closed the door behind her before she'd fully decided what she was going to say. "I found something," Denise said. "I don't think it's my place to have found it, and I need you to know I wasn't looking for this specifically, but I think you need to see it." She laid the thin folder on the desk and stepped back, the way a person steps back from something they suspect might detonate. Vivian opened it slowly. The accident report was 6 years old, the paper gone slightly soft at the corners the way old files get in humid storage. Her own name sat near the top of the page, in a font she didn't remember typewriters using anymore. She remembered the night in fragments ice on the shoulder of the road, the car spinning slower than it should have felt possible, a long gap of nothing, then hands, calm and sure, doing something to her arm that hurt less than it should have. She remembered a voice, low, telling her to stay still, to keep looking at him. That help was 6 minutes out, and she needed to stay with him for 6 minutes. She had never seen his face clearly. She had never learned his name. For 6 years she had assumed, without ever quite deciding to, that he was simply one of the paramedics, filed away in a night she mostly wanted to forget. The second page was an evidence log, and it was the second page that made her stop breathing for a moment. A single latex glove recovered from the scene, tagged and never claimed, printed with a small internal logo. She recognized instantly because she'd seen it twice before in the last 2 weeks, once on an old employment file she had never officially seen, and once, she now realized, on the inside of a folder Priya Nathanson had quietly mentioned in passing and then never brought up again. Alleran Pharmaceutical Research Division. Beneath the logo, in handwriting she would later confirm against 3 other samples, someone had written a name across the tag in blue ballpoint pen. D. Averill. Vivian sat very still for a long moment, the folder open in front of her, the 2 facts she had been carrying separately for 2 weeks now refusing to stay apart. The man the board had just placed on leave for reaching across a table to protect her was the same man who had knelt over her on a stretch of ice 6 years ago and stayed until she was safe, then left before anyone could thank him. She picked up her phone with a hand that wasn't entirely steady and called HR directly, intending to reverse the leave order before the day was out. She was 90 seconds too late. Foster had already had the internal announcement released that morning, a brief, neutral memo confirming that an employee had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal review, worded carefully enough to protect the company and vague enough to let every rumor in the building fill in the rest for itself. Vivian spent the next 4 days building a case the way she'd once built due diligence reports before she'd ever run a company quietly, methodically, and without telling the one person whose interference she could least afford. She brought in her own outside counsel rather than using Northgate's, and asked security for every camera angle covering the executive kitchen and the boardroom's water service for the 72 hours before the meeting, not just the angle that had already been reviewed. She traced the chain of custody on the water pitchers back through 3 vendors and one internal handoff that didn't match the schedule on record. Emmett Doyle came to her office on his own, unasked on the 3rd day, and set a data drive on her desk without preamble. "I should have brought you this a week ago," he said. "I told myself I needed to be sure first. That was me protecting my pension, not the company." The footage showed a junior assistant from Foster's office, badge swiped into the executive kitchen 14 minutes before the board meeting, at a time when no catering staff had any reason to be there, and Dean was 2 floors away setting up the room itself. The assistant handled the water pitcher for 11 seconds, movement small enough to miss unless a person was looking for exactly that, then left. Through Denise, carefully, deniably, a plain envelope arrived at Vivian's home that same evening. Inside was a single handwritten page from Dean, a list in careful, precise language of compounds that could produce mild sedation and vocal slurring in small doses without triggering standard toxicology screens, along with a note explaining that he'd written it from memory of his old research, in case it helped the outside lab narrow their search faster. He hadn't asked to be reinstated. He hadn't mentioned the accident report, because he still didn't know she'd found it. He had simply done the only thing that still felt like his job, whether or not anyone was paying him for it. Vivian read the page twice, then forwarded it to her outside lab that night. And the compound they'd already isolated matched the 3rd item on his list exactly. 4 days after Denise brought her the accident file, Vivian called an emergency session of the full board, citing a material finding related to the water contamination incident. Foster arrived expecting a report on facilities protocols and instead watched Vivian project the kitchen footage onto the screen behind her, followed by the toxicology results, followed, without announcement, by a scanned copy of a 6-year-old accident report with a name circled in red. "An employee of this company saved my life 6 years ago and never told anyone, including me," Vivian said, her voice level in a way that cost her more than anyone in the room could see. "That same employee was suspended 11 days ago for doing exactly the same thing a second time, in this room in front of all of you. I'd like the board to understand exactly whose water was tampered with, by whom, and why." Foster's denial was immediate and forceful, and it lasted exactly as long as it took Vivian's outside counsel to lay a printed record of wire transfers on the table payments routed through a shell consulting arrangement to the junior assistant's personal account, dated 2 days before the board meeting. Foster looked at the papers, then at the room, and understood, the way men like him always eventually understood, that the room had already decided something he could no longer talk his way out of. The board voted to remove Foster Lachlan from his position that same afternoon, 8 in favor, 1 abstention, no one willing to stand publicly on the side of what the wire transfers made plain. Vivian didn't wait for the paperwork to finish before she called Dean herself. She didn't ask him to come to the office. She drove to his apartment instead, something she would not have been able to explain to her own board, and stood in his doorway feeling less like a chief executive than she had in years. "You were there," she said, before he could say anything else. 6 years ago, on the ice. Dean's expression didn't change quickly, but something in his shoulders lowered, the specific release of a man setting down a weight he'd carried so long he'd stopped noticing its shape. "I didn't know it was you," he said. "Not at first. I only put it together once your name started showing up in the news. Years later. By then it felt strange to bring up. Why didn't you stay?" "That night, because staying wasn't the job," Dean said simply. "The job was making sure you were still breathing when the ambulance got there. Once that part was done, there wasn't a version of staying that wasn't about me." Vivian looked at him for a long moment, understanding something about the man in front of her that she hadn't fully understood in the boardroom, or in her office, or in any of the careful, formal conversations they'd had since. "The board reversed your leave an hour ago," she said. "I'd like to offer you something else, if you'll take it. Head of Safety and Compliance. Northgate's never had one. We clearly should have." Down at the office that same afternoon, Denise Marrow sat at her desk, trying to look like a woman who hadn't spent 3 sleepless nights deciding whether to hand over a file that could have cost her everything. Vivian had already told the room, in front of the full board, exactly whose diligence had surfaced the accident report, and the acknowledgement had landed on Denise harder than she expected. A junior director stopped by her desk afterwards simply to say he hadn't realized how much the company depended on people like her, and Denise thanked him, and then sat very still for a moment after he walked away, absorbing 6 years of being overlooked, finally settling into something that felt for once like being seen. Emmett Doyle got a quieter kind of acknowledgement, a handshake from Vivian on his way out of the emergency session, and a promise that his hesitation before coming forward would not follow him into his pension file. He accepted the handshake, said nothing about the week he'd spent agonizing over the footage, and went back to his monitors, because that was still the job, promotion or not. Dean was quiet for a moment, the offer landing somewhere he hadn't let himself imagine in 4 years. "I'd have to think about what that means for Ruby's schedule," he said, which was the truest thing he could say in that moment. And Vivian, unexpectedly, smiled. "Bring her by sometime," Vivian said. "I'd like to meet her." He came home that evening with something in his face Ruby hadn't seen in longer than she could easily place, not just relief, something steadier than that, something closer to a man who had finally stopped waiting for the other consequence to arrive. She didn't ask him to explain it. She just noticed, the way children notice weather changes before anyone announces them, and made him help her with a puzzle at the kitchen table instead of asking a single question about work. Dean started his new role 2 weeks later on a Monday, in an office 3 floors above the one where he used to stack folded napkins for a living. The title on his door read Head of Safety and Compliance, and for the first several days he found himself checking twice before he believed it belonged to him. Foster Laughlin's departure had been handled the way departures like his usually were: a brief statement about pursuing other opportunities, a legal team quietly managing what would eventually become a federal inquiry into the wire transfers, no farewell gathering, no one in the building pretending to be sorry to see him go. Priya Nathanson, the young HR associate who had first noticed the gap in Dean's employment file and quietly said nothing, found herself transferred to the newly formed Safety and Compliance Office within the month, a decision Dean requested personally, once he learned it was her careful reading that had started pulling the thread. She kept a printed copy of his old Halloran patent filing pinned above her new desk, not as decoration but as a reminder of what a file could hold if a person actually read it instead of skimming it. The service level itself changed in small ways nobody announced out loud. A new hire took over the water service and the folded napkins, a young man from the neighborhood who reminded a few of the longer-tenured staff of Dean when he'd first arrived, quiet and careful and easy to overlook. Dean made a point of learning his name within the first week, the way he wished someone had made a point of learning his. Vivian and Dean found themselves in each other's schedules more often than either of their assistants could entirely account for. A safety audit that required her sign-off. A compliance question that could have been handled by email but somehow became a 15-minute conversation in her office instead. Neither of them named what was happening between the lines of those meetings, but the meetings themselves had started running longer than the agenda required, and neither of them seemed particularly eager to end them on time. One Thursday afternoon, Vivian appeared on the service level for the first time since Dean's promotion, carrying no clipboard and no pretense of a work reason at all. "I have a meeting in 20 minutes, she said, "but I wanted to ask about your daughter. You mentioned a puzzle. Did you ever finish it?" Dean looked at her for a moment, surprised less by the question than by how easily she'd asked it, without the careful formality that had governed every conversation between them since the day he'd switched her glass. 400 pieces, he said. "We're at around 310. She insists on doing the sky last." "Smart kid," Vivian said. "The sky's always the hardest part." They stood there a moment longer than the exchange required, close enough to the window that the afternoon light caught the side of her face, and Dean noticed, not for the first time, how much shorter the distance between them had gotten since the week she'd first summoned him to her office to say a stiff, formal thank you neither of them had known how to finish. "I should get to that meeting," Vivian said, and didn't move for another 2 seconds before she did. Northgate marked the closing of the Ashcombe acquisition with a modest reception on the 40th floor, string lights instead of a full production, the kind of celebration a company throws when it wants to feel steady again rather than triumphant. Dean was on the guest list this time under his own name, not the catering roster, and he stood by the window for the first 10 minutes not entirely sure what to do with his hands without a tray in them. Ruby had been invited too, at Vivian's specific request, and she arrived in a dress she'd chosen herself, spinning once in the elevator to make sure the skirt still did what she wanted it to do. She found her father by the window, and without asking permission from the room or from him, took his hand and pulled him toward the small open space near the string lights where a handful of other children were being tolerated by their exhausted parents. "Dance with me," she said, in the tone of a 9-year-old who considers this a command rather than a request. Dean was, by his own admission and everyone else's observation, a terrible dancer, and Ruby made sure the room knew it, laughing hard enough that 2 nearby directors turned to watch and found themselves smiling for reasons that had nothing to do with the merger. Vivian crossed the room partway through the second song and stood near them without joining, watching a father get outdanced by his own daughter with an expression she hadn't let herself wear in the office in longer than she could remember. When the song ended, she stepped closer and rested a hand lightly on Ruby's shoulder. "You're better at this than he is," Vivian said. "Everyone's better at this than he is," Ruby said, entirely serious, and went to find the dessert table, leaving the 2 adults standing together in the space she'd occupied a moment before. They found a quieter corner near the windows once the reception thinned, city lights spreading out below them in the kind of view Vivian had stopped noticing years ago and was, tonight, noticing again. "I spent 6 years wondering who that was," Vivian said, not looking at him directly, her eyes on the skyline instead. "I used to think about it on anniversaries of the accident. Never enough to go looking, just enough to wonder." "And now?" Dean asked. "Now I don't have to wonder," she said, which is a strange thing to feel relieved about, 6 years later. Dean didn't answer right away. He looked out at the same skyline, at the small, warm shape of his daughter laughing with someone else's children near the dessert table, at the woman standing beside him, who had spent 2 weeks fighting a boardroom for a truth she didn't fully have yet, and won anyway. "I never expected anyone to notice," he said finally. "Either time." "I know," Vivian said. "That was always the problem." She turned from the window to look at him directly, and for once neither of them reached for a formal sentence to fill the space between them. "I'm not asking you to explain why you left the way you did 6 years ago," she said. "I understand it better than I would have a month ago. I'm only glad I finally know who to thank." "You already thanked me," Dean said, in front of the whole board. "That wasn't the version I meant," Vivian said, and left it there, and Dean found he didn't need her to say anything more specific than that to understand exactly what she meant. Below them, the party went on without needing either of them at its center, and for the first time since a hand had closed around a water glass in front of 9 frozen board members, neither Dean nor Vivian felt any urgency to explain themselves to anyone at all. Nobody had applauded the first time he saved her life. This time, the whole company stood up.